Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I'm going to try doing these reading streams this way, separately from the chat streams. And I'm going to focus on the reading and not worry about waiting for anybody to come in, because this is sort of an ASMR thing as well as a hanging out thing. Last time I read on stream, in the vertical format, I read part of the Call of Cthulhu by H.P. Lovecraft. I've been reading Lovecraft for a while now when I read. So I'm going to back up a few pages. I'm going to set out to read in this stream about half of the Call of Cthulhu by Lovecraft. Should take 40 or 50 minutes. I will interact with the chat if you guys chime in. I'm always up to get distracted by annotating and commenting on what I'm reading, especially Lovecraft. I'm something of an expert and always down to discuss him in the particulars for educational purposes. Of course, Call of Cthulhu is seething with racial subtext. Lovecraft, famously, when he was young, was something of a racist. And it informs his work in a really peculiar and interesting way. It develops as he goes along through his unfortunately truncated career in interesting ways. But here in Call of Cthulhu, well, I'll talk about it more as we get into it. Thanks for coming in. And I'm assuming that this, part of the reason to do this is I know those of you who want to hear me read, like you want to hear me read, so it's not exactly a chat thing the same way. Obviously, you don't need me to tell you this. You are here. Let's see if I can scooch this over. As soon as somebody comes in here, I'm going to ask questions of you guys about the microphone. I don't know where the microphone is on this laptop, actually. This is a new machine. And I definitely want a better microphone for doing this, but for now, we'll just do it with the on-deck mic. The Call of Cthulhu. Oops, sorry, guys. It starts with a quote from Algernon Blackwood. You know what? I'm going to skip that. Chapter 1, The Horror in Clay. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little, but some day the piecing together of dissociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. Theosophists have guessed at the awesome grandeur of the cosmic cycle wherein our world and human race form transient incidents. They have hinted at strange survivals in terms which would freeze the blood if not masked by a bland optimism. But it is not from them that there came the single glimpse of forbidden neons which chills me when I think of it and maddens me when I dream of it. That glimpse, like all dread glimpses of truth, flashed out from an accidental piecing together of separated things, in this case an old newspaper item in the notes of a dead professor. I hope that no one else will accomplish this piecing out. Certainly, if I live, I shall never knowingly supply a link in so hideous a chain. I think that the professor, too, intended to keep silent regarding the part he knew, and that he would have destroyed his notes had not sudden death seized him. This is very precursor to analog horror here. Also, like, if you don't want anyone to know, why are you about to explain it to us, dude? Which is also very analog horror. This is forbidden knowledge. Here it is. Let me get back to the text, sorry. My knowledge of the thing began in the winter of 1926 to 1927 with the death of my granduncle George Gamel Angle, Professor Emeritus of Semitic Languages in Brown University, Providence, Rhode Island. Professor Angell was widely known as an authority on ancient inscriptions and had frequently been resorted to by the heads of prominent museums, so that his passing at the age of 92 may be recalled by many. Locally, interest was intensified by the obscurity of the cause of death. The professor had been stricken whilst returning from the Newport boat, falling suddenly, as witnesses said, after having been jostled by a nautical-looking Negro who had come from one of the queer, dark courts on the precipitous hillside which formed a shortcut from the waterfront to the deceased's home in Williams Street. Physicians were unable to find any visible disorder, but concluded after perplexed debate that some obscure lesion of the heart, induced by the brisk ascent of so steep a hill by so elderly a man, was responsible for the end. At the time, I saw no reason to dissent from this dictum, but latterly I am inclined to wonder, and more than wonder. As my granduncle's heir and executor, for he died a childless widower, I was expected to go over his papers with some thoroughness, and for that purpose moved his entire set of files and boxes to my quarters in Boston. Much of the material which I correlated will be later published by the American Archaeological Society, but there was one box which I found exceedingly puzzling, and which I felt much averse from showing to other eyes. It had been locked, and I did not find the key till it occurred to me to examine the personal ring which the professor carried always in his pocket. Then, indeed, I succeeded in opening it, but when I did so seemed only to be confronted by a greater and more closely locked barrier. For what could be the meaning of the queer clay bas-relief and the disjointed jottings, ramblings, and cuttings which I found? Had my uncle, in his latter years, become credulous of the most superficial impostures? I resolved to search out the eccentric sculptor responsible for this apparent disturbance of an old man's peace of mind. The bas-relief was a rough rectangle less than an inch thick and about 5 by 6 inches in area, obviously of modern origin. Its designs, however, were far from modern in atmosphere and suggestion, for although the vagaries of cubism and futurism are many and wild, they do not often reproduce that cryptic regularity which lurks in prehistoric writing. And writing of some kind the bulk of these designs seemed certainly to be, though my memory, despite much familiarity with the papers and collections of my uncle, failed in any way to identify this particular species, or even to hint at its remotest affiliations. Above these apparent hieroglyphics was a figure of evidently pictorial intent, though its impressionistic execution forbade a very clear idea of its nature. It seemed to be a sort of monster, or symbol representing a monster, of a form which only a diseased fancy could conceive. If I say that my somewhat extravagant imagination yielded simultaneous pictures of an octopus, a dragon, and a human caricature, I shall not be unfaithful to the spirit of the thing. A pulpy, tentacled head surmounted a grotesque and scaly body with rudimentary wings, but it was the general outline of the whole which made it most shockingly frightful. Behind the figure was a vague suggestion of a cyclopean architectural background. The writing accompanying this oddity was, aside from a stack of press cuttings, in Professor Angle's most recent hand, and made no pretense to literary style. What seemed to be the main document was headed Cthulhu Cult, in characters painstakingly printed to avoid the erroneous reading of a word so unheard of. The manuscript was divided into two sections, the first of which was headed 1925 Dream and Dream Work of H.A. Wilcox, 7 Thomas Street, Providence, Rhode Island, and the second, Narrative of Inspector John R. LaGrasse, 121 Bienville Street, New Orleans, Louisiana, at 1908 AAS meeting, notes on same, and Professor Webb's account. The other manuscript papers were all brief notes, some of them accounts of the queer dreams of different persons, some of them citations from theosophical books and magazines, notably W. Scott Eliot's Atlantis and the Lost Lemuria, and the rest comments on long-surviving secret societies and hidden cults, with references to passages in such mythological and anthropological source books as Fraser's Golden Bough and Miss Murray's Witch Cult in Western Europe. The cuttings largely alluded to outre, mental illnesses, and outbreaks of group folly or mania in the spring of 1925. The first half of the principal manuscript told a very peculiar tale. It appears that on March 1st, 1925, a thin, dark young man of neurotic and excited aspect had called upon Professor Angell bearing the singular clay bas relief, which was then exceedingly damp and fresh. The card bore the name of Henry Anthony Wilcox, and my uncle had recognized him as the youngest son of an excellent family slightly known to him, who had latterly been studying sculpture at the Rhode Island School of Design and living alone at the Fleur-de-Lis building near that institution. Fleur-de-Lis, I guess. Wilcox was a precocious youth of known genius but great eccentricity, and had from childhood excited attention through the strange stories and odd dreams he was in the habit of relating. Nothing like Lovecraft himself. He called himself psychically hypersensitive, but the staid folk of the ancient commercial city dismissed him as merely queer. When this story was written, queer definitely just meant strange. If it was a double entendre with a reference to homosexuality here, Lovecraft would definitely have meant that to be hidden, so I don't know. Lovecraft would very much been capable of making a gay joke. But if he did so on purpose, he would have done it very subtly. I don't know if he meant it here. He might have. He called himself psychically hypersensitive, but the staid folk of the ancient commercial city dismissed him as merely queer. Never mingling much with his kind, he had dropped gradually from social visibility and was now known only to a small group of aesthetes from other towns. Even the Providence Art Club, anxious to preserve its conservatism, had found him quite hopeless. On the occasion of the visit, ran the professor's manuscript, the sculptor abruptly asked for the benefit of his host's archaeological knowledge in identifying the hieroglyphics on the bas-relief. He spoke in a dreamy, stilted manner which suggested pose and alienated sympathy, and my uncle showed some sharpness in replying, for the conspicuous freshness of the tablet implied kinship with anything but archaeology. Young Wilcox's rejoinder, which impressed my uncle enough to make him recall and record it verbatim, was of a fantastically poetic cast which must have typified his whole conversation, and which I have since found highly characteristic of him. He said, "It is new indeed, for I made it last night in a dream of strange cities, and dreams are older than brooding Tyre or the contemplative Sphinx or garden-girdled Babylon." It was then that he began that rambling tale which suddenly played upon a sleeping memory and won the fevered interest of my uncle. There had been a slight earthquake tremor the night before, the most considerable felt in New England for some years, and Wilcox's imagination had been keenly affected. Upon retiring, he had had an unprecedented dream of great cyclopean cities of Titan blocks and sky-flung monoliths, all dripping with green ooze and sinister with latent horror. Hieroglyphics had covered the walls and pillars, and from some undetermined point below had come a voice that was not a voice, a chaotic sensation which only fancy could transmute into sound, but which he attempted to render by the almost unpronounceable jumble of letters Cthulhu Photogony. This verbal jumble was the key to the recollection which excited and disturbed Professor Angell. He questioned the sculptor with scientific minuteness, and studied with almost frantic intensity the bas-relief on which the youth had found himself working, chilled and clad only in his night-clothes, when waking had stolen bewilderingly over him. My uncle blamed his old age, Wilcox afterward said, for his slowness in recognizing both hieroglyphics and pictorial design. Many of his questions seemed highly out of place to his visitor, especially those which tried to connect the latter with strange cults or societies, and Wilcox could not understand the repeated promises of silence which he was offered in exchange for an admission of membership in some widespread mystical or paganly religious body. When Professor Angell became convinced that the sculptor was indeed ignorant of any cult or system of cryptic lore, he besieged his visitor with demands for future reports of dreams. This bore regular fruit, for after the first interview the manuscript records daily calls of the young man, during which he related startling fragments of nocturnal imagery whose burden was always some terrible cyclopean vista of dark and dripping stone, with a subterranean voice or intelligence shouting monotonously an enigmatical sense impacts uninscribable save as gibberish. The two sounds most frequently repeated are those rendered by the letters Cthulhu and relief. On March 23rd, the manuscript continued. Wilcox failed to appear, and inquiries at his quarters revealed that he had been stricken with an obscure sort of fever and taken to the home of his family in Waterman Street. He had cried out in the night, arousing several other artists in the building, and had manifested since then only alternations of unconsciousness and delirium. My uncle at once telephoned the family, and from that time forward kept close watch of the case, calling often at the Thayer Street office of Dr. Toby, whom he learned to be in charge. The youth's febrile mind, apparently, was dwelling on strange things, and the doctor shuddered now and then as he spoke of them. They included not only a repetition of what he had formerly dreamed, but touched wildly on a gigantic thing miles high, which walked or lumbered about. He at no time fully described this object, but occasional frantic words, as repeated by Dr. Toby, convinced the professor that it must be identical with the nameless monstrosity he had sought to depict in his dream sculpture. Reference to this object, the doctor added, was invariably a prelude to the young man's subsidence to lethargy. His temperature, oddly enough, was not greatly above normal, but his whole condition was otherwise such as to suggest true fever rather than mental disorder. On April 2nd, at about 3 p.m., every trace of Wilcox's malady suddenly ceased. He sat upright in bed, astonished to find himself at home and completely ignorant of what had happened in dream or reality since the night of March 22nd. Pronounced well by his physician, he returned to his quarters in 3 days. But to Professor Angell he was of no further assistance. All traces of strange dreaming had vanished with his recovery, and my uncle kept no record of his night thoughts after a week of pointless and irrelevant accounts of thoroughly usual visions. Here the first part of the manuscript ended, but references to certain of the scattered notes gave me much material for thought. So much, in fact, that only the ingrained skepticism then forming my philosophy can account for my continued distrust of the artist. The notes in question were those descriptive of the dreams of various persons covering the same period as that in which young Wilcox had had his strange visitations. My uncle, it seems, had quickly instituted a prodigiously far-flung body of inquiries amongst nearly all the friends whom he could question without impertinence, asking for nightly reports of their dreams and the dates of any notable visions for some time past. The reception of his request seems to have been varied, but he must, at the very least, have received more responses than any ordinary man could have handled without a secretary. The original correspondence was not preserved, but his notes formed a thorough and really significant digest. Average people in society and business, New England's traditional salt of the earth, gave an almost completely negative result, though scattered cases of uneasy but formless nocturnal impressions appear here and there, always between March 23rd and April 2nd, the period of young Wilcox's delirium. Scientific men were little more affected, though 4 cases of vague description suggest fugitive glimpses of strange landscapes, and in one case there is mentioned dread of something abnormal. It was from the artists and poets that the pertinent answers came, and I know that panic would have broken loose had they been able to compare notes. As it was, lacking their original letters, I half suspected the compiler of having asked leading questions, or of having edited the correspondence in corroboration of what he had latently resolved to see. That is why I continue to feel that Wilcox, somehow cognizant of the old data which my uncle had possessed, had been imposing on the veteran scientist. These responses from aesthetes told a disturbing tale. From February 28th to April 2nd, a large proportion of them had dreamed very bizarre things, the intensity of the dreams being immeasurably the stronger during the period of the sculptor's delirium. Over a fourth of those who reported anything reported scenes and half-sounds not unlike those which Wilcox had described, and some of the dreamers confessed acute fear of the gigantic nameless thing visible toward the last. One case, which the note describes with emphasis, was very sad. The subject, a widely known architect with leanings toward theosophy and occultism, went violently insane on the date of young Wilcox's seizure and expired several months later after incessant screamings to be saved from some escaped denizen of hell. Had my uncle referred to these cases by name instead of merely by number, I should have attempted some corroboration and personal investigation, but as it was, I succeeded in tracing down only a few. All of these, however, bore out the notes in full. I have often wondered if all the objects of the professor's questioning felt as puzzled as did this fraction. It is well that no explanation shall ever reach them. The press cuttings, as I have intimated, touched on cases of panic, mania, and eccentricity during the given period. Professor Angell must have employed a cutting bureau, for the number of extracts was tremendous and the sources scattered throughout the globe. Here was a nocturnal suicide in London, where a lone sleeper had leaped from a window after a shocking cry. Here, likewise, a rambling letter to the editor of a paper in South America, where a fanatic deduces a dire future from visions he has seen. A dispatch from California describes a theosophist colony as donning white robes en masse for some glorious fulfillment which never arrives, whilst items from India speak guardedly of serious native unrest toward the end of March. Voodoo orgies multiply in Haiti, and African outposts report ominous mutterings. American officers in the Philippines find certain tribes bothersome about this time, and New York policemen are mobbed by hysterical Levantines on the night of March 22nd to 23rd. The west of Ireland, too, is full of wild rumor and legendary, presumably more than usual. The west of Ireland, too, is full of wild rumor and legendary, and a fantastic painter named Ardois Bonneau hangs a blasphemous dream landscape in the Paris Spring Salon of 1926. And so numerous are the recorded troubles in insane asylums that only a miracle can have stopped the medical fraternity from noting strange parallelisms and drawing mystified conclusions. A weird bunch of cuttings all told. And I can at this date scarcely envisage the callous rationalism with which I set them aside. But I was then convinced that young Wilcox had known of the older matters mentioned by the professor. Chapter 2, The Tale of Inspector Legrasse. The older matters which had made the sculptor's dream and bas-relief so significant to my uncle formed the subject of the second half of his long manuscript. Once before, it appears, Professor Angell had seen the hellish outlines of the nameless monstrosity, puzzled over the unknown hieroglyphics, and heard the ominous syllables which can be rendered only as Cthulhu. And all this in so stirring and horrible a connection that it is small wonder he pursued young Wilcox with queries and demands for data. The earlier experience had come in 1908, 17 years before, when the American Archaeological Society held its annual meeting in St. Louis. Professor Angell, as befitted one of his authority and attainments, had had a prominent part in all the deliberations, and was one of the first to be approached by the several outsiders who took advantage of the convocation to offer questions for correct answering and problems for expert solution. The chief of these outsiders, and in a short time the focus of interest for the entire meeting, was a commonplace-looking middle-aged man who had traveled all the way from New Orleans for certain special information unobtainable from any local source. His name was John Raymond Legrasse, and he was by profession an inspector of police. With him he bore the subject of his visit, a grotesque, repulsive, and apparently very ancient stone statuette whose origin he was at a loss to determine. It must not be fancied that Inspector Legrasse had the least interest in archaeology. On the contrary, his wish for enlightenment was prompted by purely professional considerations. The statuette, idol, fetish, or whatever it was, had been captured some months before in the wooded swamps south of New Orleans during a raid on a supposed voodoo meeting, and so singular and hideous were the rites connected with it, that the police could not but realize that they had stumbled on a dark cult totally unknown to them, and infinitely more diabolic than even the blackest of the African voodoo circles. Of its origin, apart from the erratic and unbelievable tales extorted from the captured members, absolutely nothing was to be discovered, hence the anxiety of the police for any antiquarian lore which might help them to place the frightful symbol, and through it track down the cult to its fountainhead. Inspector Legrasse was scarcely prepared for the sensation which his offering created. One sight of the thing had been enough to throw the assembled men of science into a state of tense excitement, and they lost no time in crowding around him to gaze at the diminutive figure whose utter strangeness and air of genuinely abysmal antiquity hinted so potently at unopened and archaic vistas. No recognized school of sculpture had animated this terrible object, yet centuries and even thousands of years seemed recorded in its dim and greenish surface of unplaceable stone. The figure, which was finally passed slowly from man to man for close and careful study, was between 7 and 8 inches in height and of exquisitely artistic workmanship. It represented a monster of vaguely anthropoid outline, but with an octopus-like head whose face was a mass of feelers, a scaly, rubbery-looking body, prodigious claws on hind and forefeet, and long, narrow wings behind. This thing, which seemed instinct with a fearsome and unnatural malignancy, was of a somewhat bloated corpulence, and squatted evilly on a rectangular block or pedestal covered with undecipherable characters. The tips of the wings touched the back edge of the block. The seat occupied the center, whilst the long curved claws of the doubled-up crouching hind legs gripped the front edge and extended a quarter of the way down toward the bottom of the pedestal. The cephalopod head was bent forward, so that the ends of the facial feelers brushed the backs of huge forepaws which clasped the croucher's elevated knees. The aspect of the whole was abnormally lifelike, and the more subtly fearful because its source was so totally unknown. Its vast, awesome, and incalculable age was unmistakable. Yet not one link did it show with any known type of art belonging to civilization's youth, or indeed to any other time. Totally separate and apart, its very material was a mystery, for the soapy, greenish-black stone with its golden or iridescent flecks and striations resembled nothing familiar to geology or mineralogy. The characters along the base were equally baffling, and no member present, despite a representation of half the world's expert learning in this field, could form the least notion of even their remotest linguistic kinship. They, like the subject and material, belonged to something horribly remote and distinct from mankind as we know it, something frightfully suggestive of old and unhallowed cycles of life in which our world and our conceptions have no part. And yet, as the members severally shook their heads and confessed defeat at the inspector's problem, there was one man in that gathering who suspected a touch of bizarre familiarity in the monstrous shape and writing, and who presently told with some diffidence of the odd trifle he knew. This person was the late William Channing Webb, professor of anthropology in Princeton University and an explorer of no slight note. Professor Webb had been engaged 48 years before in a tour of Greenland and Iceland in search of some runic inscriptions which he failed to unearth, and whilst high up on the West Greenland coast had encountered a singular tribe or cult of degenerate Eskimos whose religion, a curious form of devil worship, chilled him with its deliberate bloodthirstiness and repulsiveness. It was a faith of which other Eskimos knew little, and which they mentioned only with shudders, saying that it had come down from horribly ancient eons before ever the world was made. Besides nameless rites and human sacrifices, there were certain queer hereditary rituals addressed to a supreme elder devil or Tornasuk, and of this Professor Webb had taken a careful phonetic copy from an aged Angakok or wizard priest, expressing the sounds in Roman letters as best he knew how. But just now, of prime significance was the fetish which this cult had cherished, and around which they danced when the aurora leaped high over the ice cliffs. It was, the professor stated, a very crude bas-relief of stone, comprising a hideous picture and some cryptic writing. And so far as he could tell, it was a rough parallel in all essential features of the bestial thing now lying before the meeting. Hey, Sean. This data received with... Oh, hey, Sean. Does this microphone sound better or worse than the one on the phone? I'm assuming it sounds better. Like, better, clearer signal on my voice. I mean, I can get a mic and plug it into this laptop as soon as I make the time and money to get a mic. So it sounds a bit better. Yeah, I thought it was. I got to replace the phone anyway. The screen's getting busted up at the edges. But anyway. This data, received with suspense and astonishment by the assembled members, proved doubly exciting to Inspector Legrasse, and he began at once to ply his informant with questions. Having noted and copied an oral ritual among the swamp cult worshippers his men had arrested, he besought the professor to remember as best he might the syllables taken down amongst the Diabolist Eskimos. Diabolist Eskimos. There then followed an exhaustive comparison of details, and a moment of really odd silence when both detective and scientist agreed on the virtual identity of the phrase common to two hellish rituals so many worlds of distance apart. What, in substance, both the Eskimo wizards and the Louisiana swamp priests had chanted to their kindred idols was something very like this, the word divisions being guessed at from traditional breaks in the phrase as chanted aloud. Funglui Maglowanov Cthulhu Rulia Waganogel Fatagan. You're not banned, Raul. You're here. Anyone I ever ban out of here gets unbanned, like whenever I get around to it a couple of days later. I never click timeouts. I just always ban people completely and then I fix it later. Honestly, because I just never think to. I just scroll all the way down. Yeah, only Squid's ever been entirely banned out of here, and that's because, like I've explained a couple of times, he was weird about threats. Like, yeah. It's not the right way to put it. He seemed to be threatening to commit crimes in some other context, which would eventually make what he said in that chat some kind of evidence that I should be taking some kind of note of, and I didn't want nothing to do with it. Raul, I'm just reading Lovecraft in this stream. I'm doing chat streams in the vertical format for a couple of hours. From like 9 to 1 is what I've been aiming for lately, and then yeah, I'm gonna break off the reading streams as a separate thing and do them in this format. Because there's a lot of people who want to just hang out, mostly like really young people, kids, some of them, not children but kids, who just want to hang out and like want me to play guitar and be funny and stuff. So reading stream is sort of a different head. So this business where the strange phrase that's the prayer from the evil cults from two different parts in the world, I just realized that all of this was the model for the way they do the thing with the aliens and the melody the aliens sing in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Like it's the same story points. Legrasse had one point in advance of Professor Webb, for several among his mongrel prisoners had repeated to him what older celebrants had told them the words meant. Mongrel, by the way, in pulp fiction of this era and in Lovecraft, is just sort of a general what's the word I'm looking for? It's a slur. It's intended as a slur. Like it's dismissive and derisive and sort of means like anything but white. Like mongrel races. This is very much dovetails into what would later become the Nazi language of similar, the similar Nazi language. Like I've said elsewhere, and I'll get into it more as I read more Lovecraft, the way that he was a very typical middle class white American bourgeois racist in his youth, and those prejudices and paranoias developed into a deeper understanding and a greater wisdom is part of the reason he's really interesting. And if you read him in order, you see that develop. By the time he died, he was a committed egalitarian and socialist. He'd lived in New York for a couple of years. He'd met people who weren't white. He'd sort of gotten over it, but he didn't live long enough to write work that would have corrected the earlier impression. In stories like the Call of Cthulhu, though, you very clearly see that he, while he's got this racist bias, he works it into his fiction in a way that is insightful so as to make it useful and positive and constructive, despite the fact that it is indeed racist paranoia. I think that Lovecraft is the most important American writer to read to understand the white-black racism problem if you're not American. If you're not American and it seems very strange and alien to you, Lovecraft is essential. People in other places in the world don't worry about how white they are or how black they are the way Americans do. That is a peculiar thing to America. Other places, that's a more complex question. Legras had at one point in advance of Professor Webb, for several among his mongrel prisoners had repeated to him what older celebrants had told them the words meant. This text, as given, ran something like this. In his house at Roliad, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. And now, in response to a general and urgent demand, Inspector Legras related as fully as possible his experience with the swamp worshippers, telling a story to which I could see my uncle attached profound significance. It savored of the wildest dreams of mythmaker and theosophist, and disclosed an astonishing degree of cosmic imagination among such half-castes and pariahs as might be least expected to possess it. On November 1st, 1907, there had come to the New Orleans police a frantic summons from the swamp and lagoon country to the south. The squatters there, mostly primitive but good-natured descendants of Lafitte's men, were in the grip of stark terror from an unknown thing which had stolen upon them in the night. It was voodoo, apparently, but voodoo of a more terrible sort than they had ever known. And some of their women and children had disappeared since the malevolent tom-tom had begun its incessant beating far within the black haunted woods where no dweller ventured. There were insane shouts and harrowing screams, soul-chilling chants and dancing devil flames, and, the frightened messenger added, the people could stand it no more. So a body of 20 police, filling 2 carriages and an automobile, had set out in the late afternoon with the shivering squatter as a guide. At the end of the passable road they alighted, and for miles splashed on in silence through the terrible cypress woods where day never came. Ugly roots and malignant hanging nooses of Spanish moss beset them, and now and then a pile of dank stones or fragment of a rotting wall, intensified by its hint of morbid habitation, a depression which every malformed tree and every fungus islet combined to create. Yeah, you're right, Sean. This story, The Call of Cthulhu, is a huge leap forward for Lovecraft. Like in terms of ambition and all of this cosmic horror stuff and the way it relates to race that he's worked out here, like all this world building stuff that he's setting up here for the first time, but also the language. Like he's just this odd tone also that's like this analog horror thing where it feels semi-documentary and it's sort of science fiction and it's sort of horror and it's sort of like this Reddit post Charles Fort kind of true story vibe. Like all this is like this story is where that begins. I think he wrote The Call of Cthulhu for Weird Tales. But I'm pretty sure that part of what's going on with this confidence and the investment in this story is that he'd built up an audience already. I think he knew that he had Weird Tales in his pocket and he had that audience in his pocket, and they already thought he was just a badass among badasses as a writer of traditional horror stories. And yeah, it has the confidence of a leap taken forward by somebody who knew he was going to land on his feet doing it creatively. And it's really like it's pretty like the amount of new ground being broken in the genre in this story. I think he wrote it in 1926. I'm a little confused though because it's set in 1925, so I'm not totally sure I have that right. Yeah, it's really cool how this story sort of circles all this sort of documentary material, and then it comes out as gothic horror through this passage here. Ugly roots and malignant hanging nooses of Spanish moss beset them, and now and then a pile of dank stones or fragment of a rotting wall intensified by its hint of morbid habitation, depression which every malformed tree and every fungus islet combined to create. At length the squatter settlement, a miserable huddle of huts, hove in sight, and hysterical dwellers ran out to cluster around the group of bobbing lanterns. The muffled beat of tom-toms was now faintly audible far, far ahead, and a curdling shriek came at infrequent intervals when the wind shifted. A reddish glare, too, seemed to filter through the pale undergrowth beyond endless avenues of forest night. Reluctant even to be left alone again, each one of the cowed squatters refused point-blank to advance another inch toward the scene of unholy worship. So Inspector Legrasse and his 19 colleagues plunged on unguided into black arcades of horror that none of them had ever trod before. The region now entered by the police was one of traditionally evil repute, substantially unknown and untraversed by white men. There were legends of a hidden lake unglimpsed by mortal sight, in which dwelt a huge, formless, white polypus thing with luminous eyes, and squatters whispered that bat-winged devils flew up out of caverns in inner earth to worship it at midnight. They said it had been there before D'Iberville, before LaSalle, before the Indians, and before even the wholesome beasts and birds of the woods. It was nightmare itself, and to see it was to die. But it made men dream, and so they knew enough to keep away. The present voodoo orgy was indeed on the merest fringe of this abhorred area, but that location was bad enough. Hence, perhaps the very place of the worship had terrified the squatters more than the shocking sounds and incidents. Yeah, it's the art with Lovecraft, Raul, is one thing that's so people always make fun of him for describing things as indescribable or unnameable. But when you read it, what you find is what he means is the only way to describe it is to describe it. Like you can't say it looks like this or that. He'll very carefully describe these very strange things that you have a perfect clear mental picture of what he's describing. And so yeah, he's always had this fascination for graphic artists. Like the the thing he calls a fetish, the 8-inch tall Cthulhu doll, that this is the recounting of how it was seized in this raid. Like I've seen 50 different artists do that, like that specific object, because it's so carefully described. Like you know exactly what it looks like. They said it had been there before D'Iberville, before LaSalle, before the Indians, and oh yeah. No, I finished reading that. Only poetry or madness could do justice to the noises heard by Legrasse's men as they plowed on through the black morass toward the red glare and the muffled tom-toms. There are vocal qualities peculiar to men and vocal qualities peculiar to beasts, and it is terrible to hear the one when the source should yield the other. Animal fury and orgiastic license here whipped themselves to demoniac heights by howls and squawking ecstasies that tore and reverberated through those nighted woods like pestilential tempests from the gulfs of hell. Now and then the less organized ululation would cease, and from what seemed a well-drilled chorus of hoarse voices would rise in a sing-song chant that hideous phrase or ritual. Fungui Maglawl Nataf, Kuluriya, Waganoggle Fatagan. A little undercutting himself there, but then the men, having reached a spot where the trees were thinner, came suddenly in sight of the spectacle itself. 4 of them reeled, 1 fainted, and 2 were shaken into a frantic cry which the mad cacophony of the orgy fortunately deadened. Legrasse dashed swamp water on the face of the fainting man, and all stood trembling and nearly hypnotized with horror. In a natural glade of the swamp stood a grassy island of perhaps an acre's extent, clear of trees and tolerably dry. On this now leaped and twisted a more indescribable horde of human abnormality than any but a Syme or an Angarola could paint. I've looked this up before, by the way. Syme and Angarola are both contemporary artists that Lovecraft himself liked. In mentioning them by name here, he's actually he's pimping them a little bit. I don't remember what Angarola looks like. Syme's paintings, S.T. Joshi has used for covers of Penguin reprints of Lovecraft and Chambers and writers like that a couple times. But he's worth looking up. I don't remember what Angarola looks like, but Syme is pretty great. He's like a Nouveau era. And yeah, completely a fantasy landscape kind of artist. Really interesting. Void of clothing, this hybrid spawn were braying, bellowing, and writhing about a monstrous ring-shaped bonfire, in the center of which, revealed by occasional rifts in the curtain of flame, stood a great granite monolith some 8 feet in height, on top of which, incongruous with its diminutiveness, rested the noxious carven statuette. From a wide circle of 10 scaffolds set up at regular intervals with the flame-girt monolith as a center hung, head downward, the oddly marred bodies of the helpless squatters who had disappeared. It was inside this circle that the ring of worshippers jumped and roared, the general direction of the mass motion being from left to right in endless bacchanal between the ring of bodies and the ring of fire. It may have been only imagination, and it may have been only echoes which induced one of the men, an excitable Spaniard, to fancy he heard antiphonal, some racist crack just right in the middle of that, an excitable Spaniard. Fucking Lovecraft, dude. Everyone's some kind of wop to him. It may have been only imagination, and it may have been only echoes which induced one of the men, an excitable Spaniard, to fancy he heard antiphonal responses to the ritual from some far and unillumined spot deeper within the wood of ancient legendry and horror. This man, Joseph D. Galvez, I later met and questioned, and he proved distractingly imaginative. Yeah, you know, fucking Spaniards, their imaginations. He indeed went so far as to hint of the faint beating of great wings, and of a glimpse of shining eyes and a mountainous white bulk beyond the remotest trees. But I suppose he had been hearing too much native superstition. Do you need to come in, buddy? Are you sure? All right. Yes, Zoe? You don't need to come in. You just want to cry in the hall. So yeah, I said earlier, I didn't start to say, I said it. This racist bias in Lovecraft's fiction, in his early fiction. One, I started reading Weird Tales. I've read half of volume 1, number 1, which is actually a great deal of fiction. They must have been like this thick in modern paperback form. But the race bias and all the odd sort of faceted, multifacial, race-based paranoia, that's all over every story in the magazine. It's like the way that like nightly TV news used to have this very white, very bourgeois white, white bread bias and attitude, and they sometimes wouldn't even know that they were being racist. Like it's like that. It's just part of the culture of the pulp magazine. There, and it probably is similar. It's similar to TV. The pulp readership is the semi-educated, blue collar shading up to white collar, middle class, middle American audience, not entirely a white audience, but that set of prejudices. I mean, the TV didn't have entirely a white audience either in those days. Hey, Raul, I probably look healthy because of the camera on the on the laptop. Thanks. Yeah. The cracks about the Spaniard. That's what distracted me. That's right. Actually, the horrified pause of the men was of comparatively brief duration. Duty came first, and although there must have been nearly 100 mongrel celebrants in the throng, the police relied on their firearms and plunged determinedly into the nauseous rout. They just started shooting. I mean, it's a colored riot, right? They're cops. I mean, that's welcome to America. Are you done, Zoe? She didn't want to come in. Zoe's kind of in heat and she's crying in the hall. When I got up to let her in, she just sat out there. I'm going to read a few more pages in this before I call it. Yeah, they're both a little bit in heat, bro. I'm going to get them fixed soon. Yeah. For 5 minutes, the resultant din and chaos were beyond description. Wild blows were struck, shots were fired, and escapes were made. But in the end, Legras was able to count some 47 sullen prisoners, whom he forced to dress in haste and fall into line between two rows of policemen. 5 of the worshippers lay dead, and 2 severely wounded ones were carried away on improvised stretchers by their fellow prisoners. The image on the monolith, of course, was carefully removed and carried back by Legras. Examined at headquarters after a trip of intense strain and weariness, the prisoners all proved to be men of a very low, mixed-blooded, and mentally aberrant type. Most were seamen, and a sprinkling of Negroes and mulattoes, largely West Indians or Brava Portuguese from the Cape Verde Islands, gave a coloring of voodooism to the heterogeneous cult. I wonder, supposed to be Louisiana. Last time I read this, I noticed that bit and thought, like, he must have actually had a conversation with someone and pulled that little bit of research on ethnicities from somewhere. The older I get, the more impressive I find Lovecraft in the details. Seaman Wright, yes. Yes. Boats full of them. But before many questions were asked, it became manifest that something far deeper and older than Negro fetishism was involved. Degraded and ignorant as they were, the creatures held with surprising consistency to the central idea of their loathsome faith. So this is about to be, the next paragraph is the explanation for the first time of the Lovecraftian cosmology with the great old ones. And this context is, I explained in the other stream where I was talking about this. In the 1920s and 1930s, I guess for a bunch of cultural reasons, there was a fad for stories sort of modeled on Conrad's Heart of Darkness about voodoo as a religion and a cult, as a metaphor for the darkness and evil of Black people. And there's a lot of stories that, like Heart of Darkness to this day is controversial for the text and subtext of the race and racism in it. And that is, it's the model for whole, like I'm in the middle of watching a movie like this, Congo, with Walter Houston. King Kong is another movie in this vein from this era. Black Moon with Fay Wray. Also White Zombie with Bela Lugosi. Island of Lost Souls even. So that's sort of part of the cultural background for Lovecraft's conceit here, that voodoo is the evil Black religion, the evil non-white religion. Black and white is a polarity. So all people who aren't white are the other side, right? He keeps talking about mulattoes, about half-breeds, half-castes, mongrels. Anything that's not white is against whiteness in this cosmogony. Voodoo is a Black religion that's evil. The great old ones, the religion of Cthulhu, is an even less white religion that is even more evil. In fact, it's so much less white, it's not even human, it's pre-human. Zoe, I'm going to shoot you with the water gun, buddy. All right. I keep opening the door and she isn't coming in. Apocalypse Now is another, Apocalypse Now, Heart of Darkness is, I haven't read Heart of Darkness since I was in high school. I really need to read it again. Zoe, are you going to come in, buddy? Why don't you come in? Oh, poor kitty. Just come in. Come in, Zoe. Won't you come in? You can come in and lie down. She's hanging out in the hall and just crying at the door and scratching the carpet on the other side of the door. But when I open the door, like, she just wants the door open for some reason. You can lie down there. Yeah, just hang out, buddy. Yes, sorry. You can hang out in here. You already... Everyone likes you more than Lovecraft anyway, Zoe. Yeah, I mean, well, part of the context here too is I don't know how well Lovecraft knew this. He probably understood it fairly well. I picked up some of this from reading Zora Neale Hurston's book about voodoo, Tell a Horse. But the reason the voodoo religion is evil, projects like this demoniac vibe, it is actually embedded in its historical, because the original voodoo religion, right, it's fragments of African practice brought over by people kidnapped into slavery. In the islands, escaped slaves, ran away to the hills, hid in the jungle. The system of drums, African style drums for communication, again brought in from abroad to the islands, to the Americas. Um, the voodoo religion projecting a frightening evil in a sense that there might be human sacrifice involved. They kill chickens and stuff, was to scare the fuck out of the white people. This is a place where they're escaped slaves and their compatriots in the woods. You're working on the plantation. If you escape, if you can get away, if you can get past the guards and they don't kill you or torture you or something, they don't recapture you, you can get to where those people with the drums are. And the way those people where the drums are kept the white people from coming in and cleaning them up en masse on a lot of islands, Haiti being one of them, was they didn't know how many there were, but they suspected a lot more than they thought. They didn't have the force of, like, there were always a lot more black people than white people. So they had the guns, but they really didn't have the numbers. And yeah, these people are scary as fuck. Their religious ceremonies are about like naked people dancing and screaming and sacrificing chickens and stuff. So it actually it was built in, and it was intentional that voodoo and Santeria be frightening. Yeah, sold into slavery. Yeah, and now, like I've said a lot about Lovecraft, I don't know how much like he seems extraordinarily well researched. The state of the research on voodoo at this time, like I said, Tell a Horse by Zora Neale Hurston is a really excellent book. I think that's early 30s, late 20s. So there was a lot of cultural interest in this at the time. Why that specifically is, I don't know. I don't know what the beginning of that is. It is pretty fucking weird. I would be scared. Right, exactly. That's the point. Yeah, exactly. But before many questions were asked, it became manifest that something far deeper and older than Negro fetishism was involved. Degraded and ignorant as they... Oh, and fetishism in this context, by the way, means idol worship. It doesn't mean like sexual fetishism. Degraded and ignorant as they were, the creatures held with surprising consistency to the central idea of their loathsome faith. They worshipped, so they said, the great old ones, who lived ages before there were any men. Zoe. No, 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 no. You cannot do that. What are you doing? No. No, come on, come on. Come on. She was poised to jump onto the keyboard. Like, I don't know why she did that. All right. Trying to bust up the serious moment, Zoe. Her sister was out in the hall. That's why she was suddenly mad to get back out of the room. Oh my God, Pie Wacket, I'm not letting you in. I'm going to beat you both. I'm going to shoot you with the water gun. I shot the crack under the door with the water gun. I just want to read for 10 more minutes. Oh no, I've dampened the book. All right. Pie Wacket, are you going to come in and settle down and be quiet? Or are you just going to come in and be weird and then have to be kicked out in the hall like your sister who's just relaxing now? Yeah? You're just going to visit and say hello and go back in the hall? Mm-hmm. Put the shot collar to him, yeah. When you get your YouTuber, when you get your YouTube partnership, like the PIN number and the... I am going to shoot you with the water gun. You are so going to get it if you do that. Don't do that. Don't do it. Don't look at me like that. You know better. Come on. Come out of there. I love you too, Pie YK. Are you going to go out in the hall now, please? No? You just want to hang here right where I need to sit? All right. Are you going to be quiet so I can read a scary story? Because it's Halloween. We're trying to be scary. You're not. You're going to go scratch on the door as soon as I start reading. They worshipped, so they said, the great old ones who lived ages before there were any men and who came to the young world out of the sky. Those old ones were gone now inside the earth and under the sea, but their dead bodies had told their secrets in dreams to the first men who formed a cult which had never died. This was that cult, and the prisoners said it had always existed and always would exist, hidden in distant wastes and dark places all over the world until the time when the great priest Cthulhu, from his dark house in the mighty city of Rillier under the waters, should rise and bring the earth again beneath his sway. Someday he would call when the stars were ready, and the secret cult would always be waiting to liberate him. Meanwhile, no more must be told. There was a secret which even torture could not extract. Dude, why are you telling them then? There's something I can't tell you. All right, kid. Nothing you say or do can induce me to tell you. All right, man. Look, you couldn't torture it out of me. All right, maybe we need to torture you. Is that what you're saying? It's another thing that Lovecraft does not get credit for is having a sense of humor. He has a really complicated sense of humor. He expects you to find his stuff silly in the same way that campy horror movies and internet era analog horror are sometimes like I think if you ask Lovecraft to his face whether he's intentionally comic and expects you to laugh out loud, he might not say just straight yes. But depending on how you couch a question about it, Lovecraft would have said, "Oh yeah, I use humor a lot." Like you're not supposed to take it seriously entirely all the time. Yeah, right. Exactly, Raoul. Like, yeah. There's a lot going on here. Meanwhile, no more must be told. There was a secret which even torture could not extract. Mankind was not absolutely alone among the conscious things of earth, for shapes came out of the dark to visit the faithful few. But these were not the great old ones. No man had ever seen the old ones. The carven idol was great Cthulhu, but none might say whether or not the others were precisely like him. No one could read the old writing now, but things were told by word of mouth. The chanted ritual was not the secret. That was never spoken aloud, only whispered. Whispering is speaking aloud. The chant meant only this. In his house at Rillier, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. Never spoken aloud, only whispered. Dude. I'm not sure that distinction counts for a lot, but all right, if you say so. Only 2 of the prisoners were found sane enough to be hanged, and the rest were committed to various institutions. All right, he really is cutting up silly. Like I said, yeah, it's the same kind of flavor of campiness. This is one of the things that's really influential in analog horror online, actually. This like wandering over into like, it's just blatantly silly. But it's silly, like there's a certain kind of autistic person who would be like, I don't know what you're talking about. That's not silly at all. Like, come on. Only 2 of the prisoners were found sane enough to be hanged, and the rest were committed to various institutions. All denied a part in the ritual murders, and averred that the killing had been done by black-winged ones, which had come to them from their immemorial meeting place in the haunted wood. But of those mysterious allies, no coherent account could ever be gained. What the police did extract came mainly from an immensely aged mestizo named Castro, who claimed to have sailed to strange ports and talked with undying leaders of the cult in the mountains of China. Old Castro remembered bits of hideous legend that paled the speculations of theosophists and made man and the world seem recent and transient indeed. There had been eons when other things ruled on the earth, and they had had great cities. Remains of them, he said, the deathless Chinaman had told him, were still to be found as cyclopean stones on islands in the Pacific. They all died vast epochs of time before men came, but there were arts which could revive them when the stars had come round again to the right positions in the cycle of eternity. They had indeed come themselves from the stars and brought their images with them. I, I, I'm, I'm wondering how much Lovecraft understood the context. Like, pulp magazines were just trash pop culture, right? So, like, the way that I like trashy horror movies that are sort of late night traps for the unwary, like, did he understand that some people would have known enough about these subjects, like ceremonial magic and like Nan Maydal and ancient civilizations like Atlantis and voodoo? And like, this is a hell of a lot of research to put into the opening pages of a pulp story in a pulp magazine. How many people picked this up? And we're like, I know Lovecraft had more of a cult following in his own day as a guy who wrote for pulp magazines than literary history has recorded accurately. Um, for instance, they adapted him on Suspense, the mainstream radio show. That was the anthology show that had all the hugest Hollywood stars and directors like every week. Like celebrity directors like Orson Welles and like the biggest stars were on that show. And they did Lovecraft adaptations a couple of times and denounced it that as like adapted from the master of horror, H.P. Lovecraft, whose stories can be found in the pages of weird tales and amazing stories. So like it's not as like it's mainstream culture, but still. Um yeah, Pie? You gonna yeah, you gotta go? All right. Um It's weird how often Lovecraft seems to have been able to research subjects that he should not have been able to easily research. But he was in New England where like they had all the books. So and before the internet, like when it came to intellectual pursuits, bizarre avenues of research like ceremonial magic or the history of the ideas about lost pre-human civilizations, um, he you know, in intellectual circles in New England, there you would always know a guy who knows a guy. Like you would always have to ask around. It's like the links on the internet, but each link through a rabbit hole is an actual physical person in the real world you have to catch up with. Um, Still though, man. Old Castro remembered bits of hideous legend that paled the speculations of theosophists and made men in the world seem recent and transient indeed. There had been eons. Oh, right. I read this. I'm going to read it again. There had been eons when other things ruled on the earth, and they had had great cities. Remains of them, he said the deathless Chinaman had told him, were still to be found as cyclopean stones on islands in the Pacific. They all died vast epochs of time before men came, but there were arts which could revive them when the stars had come round again to the right positions in the cycle of eternity. They had indeed come themselves from the stars and brought their images with them. These great old ones, Castro continued, were not composed altogether of flesh and blood. They had shape, for did not this star-fashioned image prove it? But that shape was not made of matter. When the stars were right, they could plunge from world to world through the sky. But when the stars were wrong, they could not live. But although they no longer lived, they would never really die. They all lay in stone houses in their great city of Rulia, preserved by the spells of mighty Cthulhu for a glorious resurrection when the stars and the earth might once more be ready for them. But at that time, some force from outside must serve to liberate their bodies. The spells that preserved them intact likewise prevented them from making an initial move, and they could only lie awake in the dark and think whilst uncounted millions of years rolled by. They knew all that was occurring in the universe, but their mode of speech was transmitted thought. Even now, they talked in their tombs. When, after infinities of chaos, the first men came, the great old ones spoke to the sensitive among them by molding their dreams, for only thus could their language reach the fleshly minds of mammals. Then, whispered Castro, those first men formed the cult around small idols which the great ones showed them, idols brought in dim eras from dark stars. That cult would never die till the stars came right again, and the secret priests would take great Cthulhu from his tomb to revive his subjects and resume his rule of earth. The time would be easy to know, for then mankind would have become as the great old ones, free and wild and beyond good and evil, with laws and morals thrown aside, and all men shouting and killing and reveling in joy. Then the liberated old ones would teach them new ways to shout and kill and revel and enjoy themselves, and all the earth would flame with a holocaust of ecstasy and freedom. Meanwhile, the cult, by appropriate rites, must keep alive the memory of those ancient ways and shadow forth the prophecy of their return. In the elder time, chosen men had talked with the entombed old ones in dreams, but then something had happened. The great stone city Roya, with its monoliths and sepulchres, had sunk beneath the waves, and the deep waters, full of the one primal mystery through which not even thought can pass, had cut off the spectral intercourse. The great stone city Roya, with its monoliths and sepulchres, had sunk beneath the waves, and the deep waters, full of the one primal mystery through which not even thought can pass, had cut off the spectral intercourse. But memory never died, and high priests said that the city would rise again when the stars were right. Then came out of the earth the black spirits of earth, moldy and shadowy, and full of dim rumors picked up in caverns beneath forgotten sea bottoms. But of them old Castro dared not speak much. He cut himself off hurriedly, and no amount of persuasion or subtlety could elicit more in this direction. The size of the old ones, too, he curiously declined to mention. Of the cult, he said that he thought the center lay amid the pathless deserts of Arabia, where Irem, the city of pillars, dreams hidden and untouched. It was not allied to the European witch cult and was virtually unknown beyond its members. No book had ever really hinted of it, though the deathless Chinamen said that there were double meanings in the Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, which the initiated might read as they chose, especially the much-discussed couplet, "That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange eons even death may die." Yeah, I think I'm going to stop there. That's actually not the end of chapter 2 of the story, but that's the end of the story within the story. It comes back to LaGrasse at the convention, at the science convention. I was miscalculating how long it takes to read this book, actually. I thought it was like a 2-hour story. It's more like a 3-hour story. Yeah, it's weird to me that Lovecraft had this reputation for being not a good stylist. But I think part of the reason is he does this thing which, like, when he does the horror stuff, he gets silly. Like, he lets it be silly if it serves his purpose for like the horror, the genre stuff, right? The monsters come back from the dead under the water, and the like it gets creepy, and he starts doing all these sort of gothic flourishes. It's like Poe but silly. I don't know that there's any parallel for that in his time. Like, I think the first you see, like movies that are intentionally campy for fun. Yeah, no, I guess movies are doing it around then too. Dracula with Bela Lugosi actually is like that. Is often just blatantly silly, has weird tone shifts. Like it's fun in a Halloween kind of way. And that's yeah, he does this like Halloween spook show thing where I I don't know for some reason for several generations of readers it sat uneasily alongside this other stuff. I know when I was a kid and I first discovered Lovecraft, the old horror nerds and the old fantasy and science fiction nerds all were a bit dismissive of him. Um, and it wasn't because of the racism, which is one of the reasons people tend to dismiss him now. It's because they thought he was a bad stylist. And the reasons they thought he was a bad stylist were a little bit too locked in on the development of modernist mainstream literature. Um, because he doesn't develop characters. It doesn't matter. Women don't really feature in his stories. Like there are people who are women, but people are just people, and they aren't developed characters at all. Um, and for modern mainstream fiction of his era, that was sort of tantamount. Tolkien's another writer that was very widely dismissed by mainstream critics and reviewers, and to a certain extent readers in his time for similar reasons. Uh, there's no there's no character development to speak of. Um, Tolkien isn't as bad about it as Lovecraft. Uh, yeah, it reads as a guy telling a story. Yeah, Rel, it's this weird like. So I've only written a couple of short stories, but when I do, it comes out in this voice that's kind of like um, somewhere between a Rod Serling voiceover and a script for Dragnet. And I definitely get it from reading Lovecraft. It's like a reporter or like Carl Kolchak's voiceovers as the reporter talking to his recorder on the old Night Stalker TV show is another example of it. And all the new analog horror, a lot of the new analog horror and internet horror stuff is in a really similar voice and register. Like it's not, yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure how much I mean it was really radical. This story, Call of Cthulhu, is something of the departure too. Like before this Lovecraft, he's trying to do so like Edgar Allan Poe is clearly Lovecraft's central model for short stories, a lot of them. And but Poe's weird sort of semi-psychedelic like science and cosmic horror thing is just like a sub bar for Poe, right? Like Poe mostly is about psychology. But he would do this weird sort of over the top extravagant opiated fantasy stuff sometimes. For Lovecraft is more central. Like this strange material. And I don't like I haven't read his correspondence. Like I'm really obsessed with Lovecraft's fiction. Um I know that he wrote a lot of letters and exercised a huge amount of influence on a bunch of writers by corresponding so heavily. And also another thing that was way ahead of his time for Lovecraft is he was really involved in the letters column of Weird Tales. This very sort of proto-internet kind of interaction where the letters columns of Weird Tales, there was a lot of action. And there were a lot of younger writers who were inspired by the way Lovecraft and the other writers at Weird Tales would interact with their readers in the letters column. And that's how we know, and everybody knows, that Lovecraft intended the Cthulhu mythos and its elements to be public domain. He wanted other writers to steal these ideas and develop them right away. Like his idea was that the great old ones included other monsters and aliens besides Cthulhu and the other things he's mentioned here, so that other writers could come up with stuff and add them. The Necronomicon also he never intended to ever be copyright controlled by anyone, which is funny because to this day, like uh, according to the like Disney era copyright law, there should be copyright control over these elements in Lovecraft's fiction. And every now and then somebody tries to assert copyright control, and it's just he wrote it like himself like 50 or 100 times that these things were meant to be public domain. Um, Yeah, Weird Tales was a hugely popular and influential magazine in a weird sidebar way that is still misunderstood by literary historians because um, the stats don't really, it's one of those things like the joke about Brian Eno saying only 200 people ever bought a Velvet Underground album, but every one of them started a band. Weird Tales had this outsized influence on the culture. If you look through actual issues of Weird Tales, for one thing, it was an adults only magazine and it was sold under the counter because of the really advanced neoclassical art and design being full of stylized naked women. Like this thing a lot where there are nude women who don't have nipples, this like nouveau era nudity, and this nouveau era sort of psychedelicized classical art. The magazine's full of it and it's got really good design. Um, and yeah, I mean, I haven't, I really want to read the magazines through and find obscure writers and stories to read on stream. And the only reason I haven't done it yet is because if you read online and you're using the keyboard to page through it, it makes this outsized tapping noise that fucks with the sound. Is really annoying. But I can print them. Like I just need to get situated where once I get moved, I've got a printer. I just I'll print out the old like there's an archive. I think every issue of Weird Tales is scanned in online. So it's well worth doing reading through for the obscure stories that are cuz for one thing like the first line of filter for this stuff, their taste is not right for noticing which stories are good. Like I I don't think they make all the right judgment calls. I mean, for one thing, like I said, you always read that Weird Tales was full of bad writing, other than the two or three famous writers. And I've read half of Volume One, Issue One, and no, none of the stories are bad at all. Like none of them are great enough to want to read on stream. But I've read like 7 or 8 stories now. Like two of them are almost good enough to want to read on stream. None of them would be terrible. Like it's just all good stuff. Just it's not great, but it's good. Um, and they and like I said, at least the first half of the first issue, I don't know how much to like the weird race and class biases that are all over Lovecraft's writing, the fear of the wilderness, this sort of Conradian like metaphor for remote places being barbaric places, like all these elements are there. Um, But that being said, I hadn't found a good story yet. Um, you had to have an imagination to write that shit back then. There wasn't a lot to crib from. Yeah, you can. I've read almost all the important fantasy and horror literature ever before Tolkien. But it's like Tolkien and Lovecraft and Howard being reprinted. All those writers being reprinted in the mid 1960s in paperback, and suddenly starting to sell like mad. After that, there's money in fantasy and horror literature. Before that, there really isn't. It's just sort of a hobby thing. Like, so yeah, it's like 50 writers, or it's like 200 books. Like, it sounds like a lot if you're not a reader, but it's really not. Um, but yeah, by 1970, like, it's different. Um, it got to be like that with young adult fantasy. I used to love young adult fantasy and science fiction literature, and I would always have these weird conversations where I'd have to explain to reading nerds, like, no, a lot of the best books I've ever read are fantasy intended for grade school level readers or middle school level readers. And I knew so many people who didn't get that until Harry Potter happened. And when Harry Potter happened, they were like, oh, I get it now. I love these books. And now that market is so huge. I don't know. Like, I walk into a bookstore and I look at the young adult fantasy section and I'm like, how would I have no idea what to read here. There's just too much. It's too popular. It's cool. It's really cool. But when I was a kid, it was all, yeah, it was not as deep a shelf for sure. Like nowhere near as deep a shelf. And that's also part of the reason why Lovecraft and Howard and the J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis seem to be they all have all the same ideas even though they weren't reading each other, and they happen at the same time even though they weren't reading it because they were reading the same 20 other writers. They were all Dunsany fans, they were all E.R. Edison fans, they were all George MacDonald fans. Like, it's not a deep bench. So yeah, Algernon Blackwood, they're all big Algernon Blackwood fans. um Yeah, I don't know why all escapist trash literature is gets misunderstood as infantile. But I mean, I guess it's yeah, I don't know. That's like a big city bourgeois educated bias against trash literature and trash culture that I don't quite get. But we're outgrowing it as a culture now in the last 20, 30 years. Like normal I maybe because normal people all smoke weed now, actually. Like, normal people all smoke weed now, and that's just all you need to be like, "Oh, hey, dumb horror movies are actually really smart sometimes, and comic books too." Like, who knew? Um, all right. I'm going to call it and go get some food and some sleep. Cool, yeah, I'm gonna do these reading streams like this. I'm not gonna do them every night, but, I'll break off the readings as, like, their own streams in part to, so they can be used as ASMR, and so it doesn't distract the livelier chats. Uh, Thanks for being here, guys. I'll see you in the next one. I'm coming on live every night from 9 to 1, and like I said, these reading streams, I don't know when I'm gonna do them entirely, except that I like doing it late at night because that's when I like to read, so I'm probably not gonna do them in the afternoon, but I might. I don't know. I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks for being here, guys. Thanks for all. I'll see you in the next one.